Today I'm going to be talking about harvesting, extracting, and bottling. These are not my slides. I made a few small modifications, but Elizabeth did the same presentation last year. So if you saw the presentation last year, there's not going to be a lot of new content except for my witty banter. You feel free to drop off if you feel like you've got a handle on this. We are recording the presentation as well, and I'll provide the link later, so you can always watch later if you'd like. But with that, here we go. So I'm going to cover a couple of things today, just a few. We're going to go through a little bit of history of extraction, the preparations, plans, and purchases you'll want to make before extracting, how much to harvest, how to get bees off the combs, how to preserve the combs if there's going to be a period of time between when you harvest and when you extract, then the extraction process, the bottling process, and some other stuff too. So I will try and get through it all. We'll see how we do. So what did people do before extractors? Well, the original beekeeping, right, was just keeping bees in a basket or a skep. And the only way that you really harvested honey was either cut comb or crush and strain. In fact, people who don't use Langstroth frames, so if you're using like a top bar hive, for example, that's the way that you would harvest honey anyway. So you can't extract from a top bar frame with an extractor very easily. There probably is some way, and you'll probably find it on YouTube if you care. And extractors, as we know them, started about 10 years after the invention of the Langstroth hive by a guy in Austria, Major Franz Elder von Hruska. There's a story about how he came up with this idea. It's probably apocryphal, but I think it's a fun story anyway. So he gives his son like a little cut piece of comb, puts it on a plate, and the son puts the plate in the basket and then starts swinging the basket around. And he noticed that the honey starts to flow out of the comb and onto the plate. So Elizabeth told the story last year. I found the source from the American Bee Journal as well. If anybody's interested, you can just Google for it. Cool. So what are you going to need to do if you're extracting? And by extracting here, I'm going to be going through extracting with an extractor from Langstroth frames. If you have a different setup, YouTube is your friend, the internet is your friend. If you're curious, there are multiple ways to crush and strain. If you ask 10 different beekeepers for how they harvest honey, or they'll give you 10 different answers. So there's plenty of material out there if that is how you're going to do it, but I'm going to be going through how to extract from Langstroth frames with an extractor. How often do you want to extract? Well, extracting is kind of it's an event. It takes some planning, it takes some preparation, it takes some setup, it takes some serious cleanup. So you probably only want to do it once a year. Some people do it maybe twice a year, but in general, we kind of accumulate, supers of honey and then harvest once a year. Where do you want to do it? You're going to want to do it in a place where the bees can't get to you. One place that you can do that is indoors. Another place, I have like a covered patio that I just stapled visqueen around the edges of. And I had like 2 or 3 bees get in last year, but it was okay. So that kind of counts as indoors, as long as you can prevent like bees and flies and other things from getting to you while you're extracting. And keep in mind that it's going to take some time before and after as well. So you're going to want to have a place where you can do that away from buzzers. Who should you do it with? Well, you can do it by yourself if you're misanthropic, but it is highly recommended to find a friend. It is much easier to do this, and there are like economies of scale by having multiple people join together, get an extractor from the guild or otherwise, and extract all of your frames as a group, maybe like 2 to 3 people. You could help with cleanup, you could help with setup, you could help with, potentially harvesting the frames. So find a friend, or if you have a partner you can drag into it. You're probably going to need an extra set of hands at least. So, and how many days is it going to take? So this lays it out as kind of a 3-day process. It's at least a 2-day process, I would say. You can harvest one day and extract the next. I harvested and extracted in the same day last year because I didn't want to have to preserve the frames in between. And I wanted them to be warm from the hive when I was extracting them. But you can take multiple, you can split that up and harvest one day and extract the next. We can also, we'll talk a bit about like being able to harvest and then preserve the frames for a period of time before you extract them. So we'll go through that too. You're going to want to reserve the extractor. So where do you find out about where to extract the extractor? That's in the newsletter. So the newsletter has information about who to contact, who babysits each of the guild extractors, and information about the different types of extractors that they have. There is one powered extractor, and I think 3 or 4 manual extractors. I have one of the manual extractors here today, and we'll be showing you that one. Last year I used the powered extractor, so I can talk a little bit about that one too if anybody has questions. And order supply. So we'll go through what that looks like. All right. So you don't get everything from the guild. You get an extractor from the guild. You usually get some kind of uncapping tank, but not everything that you'll need. You need something to put the honey in. So you're going to need some buckets. You're going to want to get some food grade plastic 4 to 6 gallon buckets. Where do you get these? You can buy them. Under normal circumstances, you can get them from places like bakeries because they get industrial sized tubs of frosting in tubs like this. I got them from the cafes at work. And then I bought the honey gates to install on them. So you'll need a drill with like a bit that will drill through and create large enough hole. All the instructions for that come with the gates. You can buy those on Amazon. You can buy those from bee suppliers, that kind of thing. You're going to need some sieves. So I will show you what one of those looks like in a few minutes. But there are multiple kinds, and I'll show a couple of those off. And actually, I have both kinds.
I have a comment.
Yep.
Because my dad was here this weekend, and I was having him put the honey gates on a bunch of buckets. We measured the hole for the front where we wanted it to go down low, and then realized upon trying to install the honey gate that the inner screw was taller than where the gate would fit on the front. So since I made this horrible error, I wanted to share that with others. You have to be able to turn. It's a hex. The one I had was a hexagon. You have to be able to turn and rotate it. So you can't put it as low as you would like.
Yeah, mine was the same way, and I do remember almost making that mistake. So thank you for bringing that up, Shannon. Yeah, so definitely measure twice, cut once. Check the inside dimensions that you're going to need for that inside nut that screws around it.
Yes. Exactly.
Cool. You will also need jars to put honey in. You don't need that immediately. You don't want to leave honey in your 5-gallon buckets for too long because I can speak from experience that over winter, it will very likely crystallize, and you'll end up with a brick of honey larger than any warming vessel you have. So that, unless you have a hot tub. If you have a hot tub, you're in the clear. You'll also probably want some funnels. Labels are an optional thing for your jars. Drop cloths. You're going to make a mess. You think it's just a honey mess, but it's a honey plus wax mess, and wax is a real pain to get up, so it's easier to get it on something that you don't care about, like a drop cloth. Baking sheets are a good idea to put frames on as you're extracting them, so you have a surface for that. Or depending upon what kind of uncapping tank you end up getting with the extractor that you get, that might be enough, but it's good to have some anyway. And hot and cold sources are necessary if you're going to preserve and then reheat the frames for extraction, and we'll get through what that means. You'll also need, pictured here is an escape, and I didn't mention that. I skipped over it for some reason. And we'll go through what the different options for how to get the bees off the frames, escapes, fume boards are some of those examples. All right. My light's turned off for some reason. That's okay. You guys can still see me. Borrowing the extractor. You must be a member to borrow. And the newsletter has the information. I went through that already. You'll contact the host or babysitter of that extractor to reserve it. It's a good idea to look it over and make sure you have all the parts and pieces before you leave. Under normal conditions, you would go through this with the host of the extractor. Hopefully you can still do that from a safe distance. Every extractor is a little bit different, so it's good to just make sure that you understand the way that it works with the host. depending upon their comfort level, right? Masks worn, hopefully, everybody as safe as possible outside. Um, Even the largest of them will fit in the back seat of a sedan, so you don't have to worry about having a truck or anything like that. And they are currently hosted, I haven't updated this, but I think it's still true. Those are the cities in which they are hosted. And we'll go through all of the parts and pieces later when I show it off. Okay. So how much honey should you take off the hive? It depends on how strong of a honey flow you're going to have in the winter and by when. And if you're a new beekeeper, you're like, I don't know that yet, and that's true. So I would probably leave, 15 to 20 pounds on, kind of pick the middle range from this range given of 10 to 35 pounds. How much is a pound of honey? It's just Google like Langstroth frames, how much honey per, or you can read it off here. Medium frames are 6 pounds, deep frames are about 8. You're going to tally that up, and you have to make sure to not just count the full frames of honey, but also in the brood box, there are going to be crowns of honey on some of the brood frames. So as you're going through and doing an inspection, like, kind of tally it up in your head, or have a little piece of paper where you're going, okay, that's about like half a frame, or maybe a third of a frame of a deep or of a medium, and you can come up with an idea that way. You'll build up a better intuition for this the more you keep bees, the more you know how quickly eucalyptus is going to bloom in your area. So I found out this year that there's a eucalyptus tree that is very close to my house that I had just never seen before because I wasn't really looking for it, I guess. But ended up with harvest coming in November. So I gave my bees probably 35 pounds of honey because I wanted to be very cautious. And then they immediately started harvesting eucalyptus and had like very little place to put it. So I ended up having to extract again. I don't think you need to leave 35 pounds of honey on most of your hives unless you know you're in an area where there aren't eucalyptus trees or kind of early bloomers around. So that would be my advice to you. Don't leave too much on. You can always give them a little bit more. And it's usually not cold enough in the winter here that we can't inspect just quickly to see if they have stores on a warm day. So don't feel like you're going to have to seal your hives up for the winter and like not see them again until spring. We live in California. That's not a thing. We don't have winter. So like, don't leave too much honey on the hives is the story. Cool. How do you DB? How do you get the bees out? Yes, go ahead.
Can you go back slide for 1 second and explain to the beginners what the last message means?
Got it. Yeah. So how do you tell if a frame is ready to harvest? So a sure sign that honey is shelf stable is if it's capped. If you see wax cappings on the honey cells, that means the bees are done with it. They have determined that it has reached a low enough water content that it will not spoil. If you have some uncapped honey, like if a frame is mostly capped and some of it's uncapped, that's usually okay. I have found that, and I've heard, I think Oliver has also mentioned this once or twice before, that honey here tends to be drier than in places where they get a lot of rain through the summer. So even if it's uncapped, it tends to be drier than maybe in other regions. But you can Brix test it, which we'll get to at the end, to determine the water content. And if you end up with honey that is too wet, meaning that it will not be shelf stable, it will spoil eventually, depending on how much water, it could be sooner rather than later. You can do other things with it. You can make meat out of it. You can put it in the fridge. Like, don't feel like it's a waste. You don't have to like throw it down the drain because it has extra water in it. But so there are fixes for all of these things. Don't fret about it too much, but in general, you want the frames to be mostly capped if you harvest them. How are you going to get the bees off of your frames? There are multiple ways of doing this. And again, the internet is your friend. It's even more your friend once you know what the different methods are called, because you could Google for them and like watch a YouTube video about them, et cetera, et cetera. So one method is fume boards. These are a type of porous board that you usually place at the top of the hive, and you soak them with some kind of essential oil that encourages the bees to move away. You're trying to push them, the fume board's at the top, it's emitting a smell and it's pushing them away from it down into the brood box. So two examples of this are Bee Go and Bee Quick. Another one is a Bee Escape. This is called a Porter-style bee escape. They work if you have an inner cover that has the right size hole in it. If you don't have that, you could also use a triangle board. These tend to be more expensive. Porter bee escapes you can get like a pack of 5 for pretty cheap on Amazon. The triangle boards tend to be more expensive. But those would go between the supers that you're trying to extract and the brood box. And those are one-way valves kind of for bees. So they are going to go one way through them and they won't be able to come back. How well do they work? Porter bee escapes don't have the best reputation. I think that there are probably some, secret meetings within the hive about whether or not they're going to, play nicely with them or not. But they tend to not work very quickly. You may end up having to do a little bit of brushing of bees off of frames, regardless of what method you use. So just kind of keep that in mind. But I would recommend starting out pretty cheaply. Don't worry if the bees aren't off your frames. It's not like all is lost, because you can do brush and go, which is the next method that I'm going to talk about. So, yep, go ahead.
Can I just jump in?
Yeah.
With the Porter escape or the triangle board, I think the really important thing there is that you want to put that on the evening before you're going to take the harvest off, because the bees go down into the brood area much more reliably that way than just putting it on for a few hours and hoping that those bees decide to go down into the brood and don't find their way back. And then you want to also make sure that you take the honey off within 24 hours, because they will, as you say, have a little meeting and figure out their way around the one-way door if you leave it on for a week or something like that.
Cool, thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, so definitely day before. Maybe that's what a group that I beekeep with puts them on 2 days before, and maybe that's what they've been doing wrong. So thank you for that tip.
Yeah, that's mistaken.
Cool. Brush and go. So this is what it sounds like. Generally, you'll take a frame over the hive. You will quickly shake it downwards to shake most of the bees off the frame. Then you'll use a brush or a branch of like pine needles to brush the remaining bees off the frame, and then quickly run away and put them in a box and put the cover on the box. I will show you what that looks like when I do the demo part, in case that wasn't enough of a visual. Drumming, Google it. There are videos for this, but it is also what it sounds like, oddly. It's actually taking a super in front of the brood box, like near the entrance, close to dusk, and like rhythmically drumming the sides of the super, and the bees march out, and it's pretty magical. It seems like this is usually a method used for oh shoot, not top bar, but Elizabeth, help me out here.
War users use this traditionally. I don't think it's a great method for a beginner usually. I'd go with brush and go or a Porter
style. Like or if you have a leaf blower, instead of brush and go, you can do blow and go. So you can actually take the entire super, put it sideways. So like, the top of the frames are facing you, and use a leaf blower. That also might end up in disaster. As long as the top of the frames are facing you, not the bottom, you're not going to blow them out of the box because the ears will keep them in. But watch, there are YouTube videos for that too if you're interested. Cool. Preserving. So frames are not just honey. They may look like they're just honey, but it's very likely that they're honey and eggs of little creatures that live in your hives. Not just bee eggs, but wax moth eggs and hive beetle eggs. So it's not a good idea to leave them alone for too long. So either extract within 24 hours. Like I said last year, I extracted pretty much immediately so that they were still warm from the hive. Or you'll want to freeze them. You may have heard of people using mothballs. That is not a good idea. Mothballs are a fumigant, and that smell will get into your honey. It's also not a great idea for the frames that don't have honey in them that you're just trying to preserve over winter. we as a guild do not generally recommend the use of mothballs. In fact, neither does the ag department of the county. They don't consider that like a legal thing. So freezing is probably the easiest way to deal with this. You can you'll need space in a freezer. A chest freezer is probably the easiest. I have like an old like side-by-side freezer that has enough space, but another way is using dry ice. So we'll go over like a diagram that Elizabeth put together of how to do that in a minute.
What it doesn't say here is to not put it in the refrigerator.
Yeah, it's going to make a mess, whatever kind of fridge or whatever kind of freezer you put it in, rather. But the fridge is not cold enough. You need to actually freeze the eggs to kill them. And if they're frozen, like the honey's, this is something else that I think is a misconception. Honey doesn't crystallize at freezer temperatures. It crystallizes at like winter house temperatures of around like 50 degrees Fahrenheit is kind of the perfect temperature for honey to crystallize. In fact, if you're making creamed honey, you're looking for like a 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit environment to crystallize the honey. So if you put it in the freezer, you can actually leave it for quite a bit before you decide to extract. You will, however, if you freeze it, need to warm it up again to extract it. Extracting frozen honey is not going to go so well. This kind of gives an idea for how you could freeze the frames with dry ice if you decided to do that. Here you have a box of some kind. I think it says insulated. I have to move people's faces out of the way. There we go, yeah. So this is like, could be a cooler. It could be some other kind of insulated box. You want to make sure it's not airtight because dry ice is expanding and releasing CO2. And you'll place the dry ice on top of the frames. You can leave them in the supers, which is what's shown here. So an empty hive body on the top, an empty super, for example, with dry ice in it, and then the stacks of supers underneath. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Warming. So if you have frozen your frames, you will need to warm them up again. The goal is to get them around to hive temperature, around 94 degrees. And you can do that by putting them in like a bathroom or another small room with a space heater. You can also do a cool thing with an electric blanket. So again, it's another box that we are, it's very similar to the dry ice thing that I was talking about before, where you've got probably like, you could use a cardboard box for this. It doesn't have to be insulated, but you're just trying to keep honey off of your electric blanket. So on the inside, these orangish looking things are the hive bodies with the frames in them, the supers stacked up on top of each other. On top of that, you'll want some kind of covering. It could be a black plastic bag. It could be a cardboard box to separate the sticky things from the non-sticky things. Then an electric blanket on the outside of that, and then some kind of insulation on top of that. So like a comforter. And you can leave them in there to warm up for, you'll probably want to leave them for like 24 hours or so to get them back up to temperature from completely frozen, maybe a little bit longer. You can go in and check.
We have a comment from Mark to everyone which says, there are kitchen supply stores that have oversized baking trays that work great for putting a full super on if you have a freezer large enough to hold them.
Nice. Thank you, Mark. Okay, so you've got your frames. They have either been freshly harvested or frozen and thawed, and now you've got to uncap them. So, if you were paying attention before, most of your cells should be capped. That is a sign that they are that the honey is ripe, that the honey has a low enough water content. So to uncap them, again, there are multiple tools you can use for this. You can use a sharp knife, a serrated knife, a hot knife, which I'll have an example of in a few minutes, or an uncapping fork. And I'll spend more time going over this once I have items I can demo with. And you'll want to do this over a tank or a tray because those cappings are useful wax. They also still have honey all over them. So you're usually not going to throw those away. Those are an important part of the harvest. And also, you just generally trying to keep them from getting all over the place. You want to get them in some kind of container. Okay. There are multiple kinds of extractors. Tangential and radial. And this shows a diagram of what that means. The one that I'm going to show is a tangential, because that's the one that Trish was very nice enough to deliver so that I could demo it. But the guild also has some radial ones. So the extractor uses centripetal force, like a kid spinning a plate of honey in a basket, or a honeycomb in a basket, to extract the honey from the cells and throw it out onto the walls of the tank. And then the honey drips down the sides of the tank to the bottom, and then you collect it. That honey will have lots of little bits of wax in it, and potentially some dead bees or bee legs or what have you. So you're going to want to filter that before you consider it kind of ready to bottle. I will go through that in a bit too. So why are we doing this rather than a crush and strain method? So as I think we've talked about before, creating comb is one of the most energy intensive things that bees do. So as much as you can preserve that comb for them so they can reuse it, the better. If you are only extracting a small amount, sometimes it doesn't make sense to do all of the setup and cleanup required to do extraction with an extractor. That is a great opportunity to work with someone else who's already borrowing the extractor. So crush and strain is not your only option there. But if I only had a couple of frames to extract, I probably would either find a friend who's already extracting or just crush and strain. But if you're doing enough, it makes sense to use an extractor because that's going to allow you to preserve the frames and the bees can reuse them without destroying all the comb. Radial versus tangential, we went over. Flipping versus non-flipping. So the radial, I don't believe you need to flip. So the, tangential, you'll need to flip the frames because only one side is facing out. And most of our extractors that are radial, if you're extracting deep frames, it has an insert and then they're extracted tangentially, I believe. So you talk about that with the host for your individual extractor, like let them know what kinds of frames you're extracting, if it's just mediums, just deeps, both, and they can walk you through what you'll need to do. And like I said, one of them is electric, the rest of them are hand crank. If you're doing a lot, or if you've got a big party, like, 2 or 3 or more people extracting frames together, it might make sense to get the electric one. It is in Half Moon Bay, which is kind of a slog for, depending upon where you are, but it might be worth it. Cool. So now how do you extract? You're going to be spinning these frames in a tank effectively, right? We talked about this. That spinning the frames are not usually the same weight. So if you've ever if you've ever watched your front load washing machine try and self-level itself, it's usually a little bit wobbly to start. And that's going to be true of the extractor as well. Expect that it's going to try and run away from you as you're spinning it. The one that we have to demo today is really small and doesn't have a way to secure the feet to the base, to a base, but some of them do. And whenever possible, it'll make your life easier if you can secure the extractor to like a piece of plywood, or like this one that I have to demo today, you could put weights on the feet to hold them on. But in general, like you're gonna wanna try and secure that tank to something as best as possible. Otherwise, you're gonna end up hugging it or having a friend hug it while you spin. Make sure you don't have any dangling clothes, hair, jewelry. Those things can get stuck in the extractor and be a really bad time. Ears go outward. So I will talk about this a bit. The ears go outward part is important for radial extractors. So if you have a radial extractor, the ears are the tabs on the frame. So those go toward the outside of the tank rather than the inside. If you get this wrong, it's not a huge deal. It's just that the cells, if the frame is vertical like this, the cells are actually they're not completely perpendicular. They're actually at a little bit of an angle. So if you put that sideways, it's better to extract with the ears out rather than the ears in. Somebody correct me if I got that backwards. and then start and stop slowly. So yeah, you're like, just like your washing machine, you're going to want to like get a feel for whether or not it's leveling or not, how it's going to jump around. You'll want to keep it balanced as much as possible. Don't put like a frame in a position that doesn't have a frame to counterbalance it, if that makes sense. And keep gates open and flowing. I have a confession to make. When I started extracting last year, I forgot to do this, and the motor on the electric one, stopped working for a moment, and I thought I'd broken it. So don't be me. Make sure that you are not filling the bottom of the tank full of honey, because the motor does have a safety on it, but don't rely on that. Make sure that the honey is able to flow out, because what will end up happening is the honey at the bottom will eventually catch the spinning mechanism, and it won't be able to spin anymore. So make sure the honey is flowing out. And don't force anything, right? Like if this goes for your body and also the extractors. The extractors are expensive. They are a shared resource. We do not want them to break. Yeah, also like, if it hurts, don't do it. Like for the manual extractors, make sure that you're like, spinning them at a rate that is comfortable for you. You don't need to go crazy with them. So, this is a hobby, for most of us. Make sure not to hurt yourself.
It's definitely a place to remind you that there is no stupid question. If you're not sure and haven't used the extractor before, feel free to call your extractor host or email with questions.
There are also some extractor notes here. Almost all of them are radial for mediums. One of them is tangential. I guess it's the one that I have. And then, all have inserts for doing deep tangentially. I mentioned that. Most are 8-frame, and please take excellent care of them. So yeah, we covered all that. Cool. Straining. So, like I mentioned, the honey is going to have stuff in it, so you're going to need to filter that stuff out. You don't have to, if you're not selling the honey or giving it to people who like little bits of bug legs in their honey. You wouldn't really, no one will force you, but most of us strain our honey when we extract it. So the way of doing that usually is you're going to drop the honey out of the extractor into a bucket, and then from one bucket into another bucket that has a strainer on top of it. We don't recommend putting, you may think you can skip a step by dropping the honey out of the extractor into a strainer. If you're very careful, yes, you can do that, but you need to be paying a lot of attention to how much honey is falling into that strainer to make sure that it doesn't overflow. It is oftentimes easier to just let it drop into a bucket that doesn't have a strainer in it and then strain from there. But, you do you, just be careful. One strainer at a time. There are some strainer sets that have like a coarse strainer on top of a fine strainer, and they kind of sit inside one another. I have used those like in combination, and it works. But if you have the kind of strainers that are, I'll show you the ones that were pictured here. These type of strainers, it doesn't make sense to double up. There's no space between them unless you build a cool contraption. So generally one of those at a time. Cool. Start with the coarsest strainer, go to the finest, so the biggest holes to the smallest holes. Stir, scrape, clean as needed. So you might need to push some of the honey out of the bottom of the extractor to get it. You might get a clog with some wax and that sort of thing. So pay attention to what's going on. Yep, and I mentioned like you're going to drop from one bucket to the next. We'll go over that too when I have something to demo with. All right, cool. Heat helps. So like if the frames are warm, that's going to make it easier. Otherwise, it may take a while for things to strain. So especially in, if it's cold or cool, and depending upon how thick your honey is, how much the bees have removed water from it, it could take a while for it to strain through. So you want to have a place where you can do that inside. Okay, also strain capping separately at the end. Yeah, so the cappings tank is going to have the honey that has the most wax in it. So you don't want to clog up all of your nice extracted honey with your cappings honey. strain all of your extractor honey first, because that's going to be cleaner, and then deal with the cappings. If you mix it all together, you're just going to clog up and slow everything down for your whole process. Wash bottom bucket and dry thoroughly before doing final strain to avoid any final debris. Yeah, so like, if you've got a bucket that had debris in it, and you filter that through, the honey that's in there, if there's a little bit left at the bottom, you'll want to scrape that out and then wash it out, because there'll be little bits that you'll want to get out before putting into your final clean bucket, so that you don't reintroduce any small particles. Yeah, you're also, honey is more likely to crystallize if it has particulate matter to seed the crystals. So you'll want to try and prevent that. So make sure to use clean items. You'll also want to use dry items so that you don't dilute the honey with water. And yep, so if you plan on having more than 4 gallons of honey, you will need more than 2 buckets to hold and strain it. So if you have 4 gallons, a 5-gallon bucket will do you. 2 5-gallon buckets will do you, because you'll be dropping from one into the other. If you have more than that, you will need more buckets. Cool. So actually, I'm going to take a break here before we get to bottling, and go do the demo portion. It will take me a moment to get everything set up outside. Elizabeth, Shannon, would you guys mind taking a few questions while I go get set up?
Yeah, we did
Sure.
one
Okay,
comment here on the chat when we were talking about the balance of the extractor. You can hear when there's a weight imbalance, like if there's some frames that are heavier than others. And so if you lean on the extractor while it's spinning, you can counterbalance it yourself. But you should try and be aware of that when you're putting the frames in. You can feel the weight in your hands. If you have 2 heavy frames and 2 light frames, and you obviously want to put them across from each other. And then just to further clarify, we do have 2 electric extractors. I host the one in Redwood City. It's only a 2-frame extractor that's electric, but it doesn't have any equipment with it. I have an extractor only. I don't have any of the tools or cappings tank. And again, for folks that if you didn't hear, that's in the newsletter each month. So if you're looking for the contact to reserve an extractor near you, it's always in the newsletter. It's not on the website. And Mark is also saying to be careful if you're leaning on the extractor for a weight imbalance. He's broken the plastic lid that drops down. And one other thing I was going to mention, we may have this in the slides further forward. You're never going to put any cleaning solution inside the extractor. You're only going to clean it out with water. I get that question a lot. Elizabeth, do you put your extractor out and let the bees clean it up in another place in your yard, or do you hose it out?
No. That's called open feeding, and that's a really bad idea generally. What I just do, my extractor, my personal extractor actually lives in my laundry room, which sometimes gets called the extraction room. And I just spray it out and rinse it down when I'm done with it. You don't want to be putting open honey out in your yard, especially in the late summer and the fall, because that will set off a robbing frenzy, and it'll also make you really unpopular with your neighbors, because you'll have basically a bee-nado going on out there, like a tornado of bees. So I don't recommend doing that. The honey will come off very easily with some warm water. And what I actually had to clean mine is I just went to the dollar store and bought a brand new toilet brush, so I could just reach down in it, because I'm short and I've got short arms, and just rub any of the honey gently with that to get it to rinse away.
Yeah, and I was going to say, like a commercial grade spatula with a long handle on it is probably good for that also. We do have another comment here from Sophia, who has a great idea to upcycle the cardboard sheets that they put between canned goods at Costco. She uses that instead of a drop cloth. And when it's done, she could just put that into the compost, which is a great idea. So you don't have to wash something, because you do get honey all over. And you should always have a bucket of water and a couple of washcloths or hand towels that are wet for yourself, because you're going to want to rinse your sticky fingers as you go along.
Okay.
Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
as long as you speak loudly.
So, first things first, I set this all up. Oh, by the way, I'm dressed in my Sunday best for pretty well. My partner here was taking work calls very late, so I couldn't change clothes or shave before any of this. So I'm begrudgingly put this video up for them to watch later, but maybe not forever because I'm really slumming. First, let me show you guys what it looks like. Imagine that this frame was not empty. So use your imaginations a bit. But I wanted to talk a little bit about, first of all, brush and go. So imagine that you've got a frame inside your hive that you want to extract. So this is the beautifully capped honey. Maybe a little bit of it's uncapped, but that's okay. But it's covered in bees. I would also be wearing a veil at this point. That's just me. Do you. But I'm going to want to get the bees up. So let's say that I use a quarter bee escape, but there are a couple of bees left on it, or maybe I don't have one because I'm a first-year beekeeper and I'm thinking, no, I'm probably not going to need that. So you've got a frame full of bees, you need to get them off. So I'm holding this over the hive. I'm going to quickly shake it downward. So I'm going to hold it by the ears and I'm going to kind of whack it downward to shake off the majority of the bees. Then I'm going to have a brush ready, or a branch with pine needles or something. And I'm going to brush off any remaining bees that I see, and then I'm going to quickly throw them in a box that I have already unclasped the lid for, like this one, and I'm going to put the lid back down. It's okay if there are a couple bees left on it. You want to get the majority of them out, maybe not all of them. That's okay. We can deal later. And you're going to do that over and over again. It is easier if you have a friend. It is easier if you have somebody like a partner or a friend that is standing by, and it's just like a lid opener closer. So you can throw the frame in, and they can quickly put the lid back down to keep the bees from flying in after.
And another really good thing, Alex, you might want to share is it helps to just have a wet towel over your bin so that the bees have something to attach to. If you have a wet towel over your bin, the bees will climb off of the frames and attach themselves to the towel, and then you can shake the towel over the hive.
I think Shannon just offered some tips. I don't have the phone set up so that I can hear anything. So the next thing that you're going to need to do once you've got the frames harvested is to use them. So for that, there are a bunch of different ways to do this. I'm go on this side so I don't get close ones. So one way is an uncapping fork. And this is an example of an extraction tank. So this came with this extractor. These two live together. So I have got this set up as you would if you were extracting. I have a tank at the bottom, a screen to catch like gross particles and like large chunks, and then a balancing nail screw here at the top. And so I can balance a frame on this so that I can easily spin it around as I am uncapping, if that makes sense. This is kind of the easiest and cheapest method, is to use an uncapping. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to get under the cappings and then tilt up to lift the cappings off. This is not a scraping fork. You're not going to want to do this. This is not very good at removing a lot of surface area of wax, and it just kind of destroys like the tops of the cone. So it'll do something, but it won't do as much as you could be doing with the same fork, with the same tool. So dig under the cappings and then lift up. It's uncapping, not scraping, if that makes sense. You can also use a knife. Here, this particular kit comes with a hot knife. This plugs into a wall. Not all of them, actually I think all of them. It's got a little dial on it, which is pretty cool to control the current so that you can determine how hot it gets. If it gets too hot, you're going to end up burning The honey, caramelizing the honey as you cut, so kind of adjust as you go. But it's going to be a similar kind of idea where you are cutting down the side of the frame to uncap, nice and slowly, not digging too deeply. You're just trying to remove the cappings. You're not trying to cut the cells in half. You want as much honey as possible to remain in the frame so that you can extract it in the extractor, which will be cleaner than trying to extract it from all the cappings. Once you have your frames uncapped, you're then going to place them in the extractor. This is a very small extractor. It's only got a slot for 2. I just removed the lids, and now I'm going to arrange it so that the basket is facing that. And I wouldn't be spinning this normally without having another frame on the other side. If you had an odd number of frames, you could put one of the extracted frames on the other side to provide a little bit of weight. That is better than having no frame there. Then I'm going to put the lids on. Why are we putting the lids on? Well, because when you spin this, the honey's not just going to hit the sides of the tank, it's also going to hit the top. So you want to have a screen there to prevent the honey from flying in your face. And then you're going to spin, right? And this I don't have weighted down, but you're going to want to spin until you see less and less honey flying out of the sides. And you should feel like it's getting a little bit easier because the frames are getting lighter. And then eventually you'll have extracted the honey from one side. Because this is tangential, as all deep extraction will be with our extractors, I will then need to stop. And then, don't catch your fingers in. I'm going to do it for the purposes of demonstration. And you're going to need to flip it to the other side because both sides have honey on it. I will also, of course, need to have uncapped both sides of the frame. Don't forget to do that. And then I would do the same thing again. Okay. Now, the next step is I've got honey. Remember that this is not a valid setup. So this isn't a valid setup because I have this gate plugged, which means this tank is filling full of honey. Eventually, I'm going to get to a place where this tank is filling to a point where it's catching the spinning mechanism, like I mentioned before. So we don't want that. We want this to be dropping into a bucket. So this is a pretty short one, a pretty short extractor. You probably want to have this propped up on something if you're going to get to a 5-gallon bucket. So let's pretend like I did that. So I'm going to go ahead and move this onto the table. Table's not a good place to keep an extractor, but for the sake of demonstration, there we go. So this honey is now going to be dropping out of this gate into the bucket. So as I mentioned before, the safest thing to do is to not have a strainer on this first collection bucket. But you can. This is what that would look like. This is an example of a strainer, like a 2-piece strainer that has a coarse mesh and a fine mesh, if you can see that. And they nest inside one another. It's got little adjusters so that it'll fit on whatever size container you're putting it on. And the top strainer will catch the big chunks. The bottom strainer will catch the little particulate bits of wax and flow into the bucket. So safest way to do this is to not put a strainer on top of this first bucket, but rather to collect. And then if I had a second bucket, I'd be dropping from the bucket that was unfiltered into this. If you can also get these types of strainers, which are meant to be in 5-gallon buckets. This is actually a 4-gallon bucket, but it also fits. So you need to want to use these one at a time. This is a slightly finer mesh than these two, which is why I got it as an extra kind of filtration in case I want to have really finely filtered honey. But these come in sets of different microns, so you can filter from coarsest to finest. Cool. I think that is it for the demo portion. So I'm going to run back inside to the slides, and we will finish up there. Feel free to take questions while I'm doing that.
Any questions?
So just to reiterate, you're never going to put the extractor up on a table because it's not stable. You're always going to keep it on the floor. Some of the extractors have bases and some don't. You shouldn't ever need to take the legs off of the extractor to transport them. I've had that question also. Most of them can lay down in the back seat of a normal sedan. You don't need a truck, which I think Alex mentioned also. And we did have a comment from Alice. She said to remind you that Lowe's sells food grade 5-gallon buckets. Another great place to get 5-gallon buckets that are food grade is like your local bakery or donut shop. They'll usually give them to you for a couple bucks. Just remember to ask for a lid.
The only thing I would add on the bucket thing is if you are getting buckets from other sources, try to get ones that had icing in them. And if you do get given one that had, say, peanut butter or sesame or something like that, I would not use those because those are common allergens, and you don't want to end up accidentally giving somebody honey that's contaminated with peanuts or something.
That's a really good point, Elizabeth. Really good idea.
But icing is fine. And don't think you're going to get pickle smell out of buckets. It doesn't happen.
All right, cool. Thank you for taking a few questions. Sorry, just a second. Okay, cool. So once you've gotten everything extracted, I think I probably skipped a couple of slides. There we go. We talked about straining, bottling. So once you've got a nice bucket of clean filtered honey, you will want to bottle it so that you can sell it or give it to friends or store it. You're going to want to make sure you have ample jars to do this. You will end up having more honey probably than, to do with maybe not your first year, but eventually as a beekeeper, even with 1 or 2 hives. So your friends will be very happy to take some of that off your hands. So 1 gallon of honey weighs about 12 pounds. A gallon is 128 fluid ounces. All of these conversions here can help you figure out how many jars you need along the right. Where can you get jars? You can buy jars. You can buy them from jar suppliers. There's the name of a jar supplier in Oakland that I can't remember, where I know a bunch of people get their jars from. You can get mason jars from hardware stores or from big box stores. You can buy specialty honey jars from Dedant or other beekeeping supply companies. What else? Oh, you can get them for free. A lot of times people will list in particular mason jars or sometimes like, like mayonnaise jars and that kind of thing on Craigslist or on Facebook Marketplace. So, check that out. Like that's a good way to get a lot of jars, especially if you don't care if they're different sizes. Glass is easy to clean. So, yeah, that's a good tip. Oakland bottle. It's here on the frame on the slide. Labels. Do labels after filling. Why? Well, you're probably going to get some honey on the sides of the jars, and you may end up putting less honey. You may not end up putting honey in that jar at that time. So it's a good idea to not pre-label your jars. You can buy labels from a stationary supplier or a bee supplier. It usually doesn't make sense to print labels. Like it usually costs more in terms of ink and label paper than if you were to get them professionally made. For a hobbyist beekeeper, you probably want to just have a couple write-in fields. Design your label out for the kind of jar that's going to work with the kind of jars that you're using, and you can leave a little blank where you write in the year with a with a permanent marker. Potentially when it was harvested, that sort of thing, what kinds of flavors, kind of flavor notes or what have you on the label if you want. There are a couple of things about labels that you're going to want to adhere to if you are selling your honey, and also maybe not to mislead your friends. Pure honey or wildflower honey is generally fine. Wildflower just generally means like a bunch of different sources. If you're harvesting honey not in an agricultural area that is doing monocultures, then you're going to have wildflower honey. You're not going to have honey that is like entirely one thing. I think the exception to this is probably eucalyptus honey, especially along coast. I think that's probably a lot of people who harvest eucalyptus honey there will label it as eucalyptus honey because it is primarily eucalyptus if they harvest it at a certain time. So, but that probably won't apply to most of us. For the most part, it's going to be a mix of different flowers, so it's just called wildflower honey. Raw is an okay label if you haven't heated it too much. Like heating it with the electric blanket to warm up the frames like we talked about, that's fine. But if you heat it past a certain point, it loses its raw characteristics. I'm not going to get into that too much right now. But you don't want to put organic or non-GMO. Organic certification is difficult to get. I don't know a whole lot about this because I don't sell my honey. I'm sure some other people can speak to it. If anybody has questions, feel free to ask questions. We'll answer them. You're going to want to put the weight in ounces and grams, not the volume. Honey is sold by weight. If you're just giving it to your friends, you can label it however you want. And your contact address. I think that is part of the necessary label for selling honey. And yep, put in a little extra. Like if you're not entirely sure, like of your scale that it's 100% accurate, it doesn't hurt to just do a little bit extra to go over the mark to make sure you give a full legal measure. And there are also special labels you can get that warn about like giving honey to infants or like honey not being destroyed if it crystallizes, like how to remove the crystals from honey to make it liquid again. You'd be surprised how many people think that once honey crystallizes, it has gone bad and they need to throw it out. So. Okay, so after you've extracted these frames, you got all the honey out of them, what next? You have what are called stickies, these frames that are covered in honey but not full of honey. You do not want to place these in the open for bees to lick. This invites a robbing frenzy, especially here when we have a dearth in August and September. You're going to attract bees from your neighbors, from other hives, wild hives nearby, and those bees are going to come near where your hives are. They're going to lick up all this honey on these frames, along with probably some of your bees, but then they're going to smell the honey that's in your hives, the honey that you left them for winter, and they're going to rob those hives. So to protect your bees, you should not put stickies out in the open for them to be licked. You will probably find some beekeepers that are in the guild that do this. There are probably some conditions under which, like, it's still not legal, but is less likely to cause a robbing frenzy. But for the most part, if you are watching this, you are a beginner and you should not be doing that. It's not worth the risk to you or to your neighbors. You're going to want to place the super full of stickies. So, you know, as you're extracting, you're removing the frames from your super. After they're done extracting, you put them back in the super. You want to place that super full of the stickies on top of a strong hive between the inner cover and the outer cover. And the reason you have the inner cover separating it is it kind of gives a signal to the bees that, like, this isn't really part of our hive right now. This is just a room full of, like, delicious sticky frames that I need to go lick and then move that honey back into the brood chamber. Does this always work? No. Another thing that you can do is put another box in between, like just a hive body that creates more empty space between the stickies and the rest of the brood box. So just, you know, that's something else you can do if you'd like. If bees are storing instead of cleaning, add empty box. Okay, yeah, so I went over that. Also, if the flow is still on, you can place it back on the hive for bees to refill. So this is if you, like, we're planning on doing multiple extractions in a year, you could always place those frames back and they'll start cleaning them up and filling them back up again. Could I ask for help? Well, let's see. It's fine. Somebody is unmuted and fiddling with a paper bag or something like that. So if you wouldn't mind checking. Okay. Storage of drawn frames. So you're not going to put all of, after your stickies are cleaned up and you're ready to store them for the winter, because you're not going, there's not going to be a flow for some period of time. Remember here, you might have flows as early as November with eucalyptus, depending on how much rain we get. But there may be a period of time where you want to store your supers off of the hive. It's best to freeze them either again or for the first time to kill any eggs that are on them. Dark frames that have cocoons in them are at more danger of getting in moths and hive beetles, but like it can happen to any frames. You'll want to store those in kind of container. They don't need to be refrigerated. You know, they can just be room temperature, but you're going to want to kill any kind of eggs or larvae that are on them, and then seal them away so that you can't get moths and beetles on them after you've kind of frozen them to kill everything that's on them. Note, moth larvae can eat plastic bags. So if you have larvae in them, like putting them in a bag isn't going to help. But if you've frozen them, then you can put them in a plastic bag because the moths won't be able to get in to lay eggs.
And just
Cool.
to note, there's been discussion over this of whether 48 or 72 hours is adequate to kill the larva. So don't be afraid to do it for 3 days.
Cool. Cleaning up. So you're going to want to clean up all of your tools, your work area, but most importantly, you're going to want to clean up the extractor and all of the tools that you're returning to the guild. Do not return sticky equipment back to the caretaker for that extractor. They will not be happy with you and may make you go back home and try again. So you're going to want to rinse everything thoroughly. Cold water is better for removing wax, and hot water is better for removing honey. So I think for the most part, people tend to use just like water from a hose or room temperature water to clean up. When I picked up the electric extractor in Half Moon Bay last year, the keeper of that extractor told me not to use any soap because the soap residue can leave a nasty taste in the next person extracting's honey. So she was happier having it smell a little bit like honey as long as it wasn't sticky, so that the next person wouldn't have to deal with any kind of soap residue. I think that's probably a pretty good rule, but talk to the caretaker of your particular extractor if you have any concerns. For the most part, it's okay if you still have, as long as things aren't sticky and gunky, that's a good state in which to return things. Make sure they're dry as well. Put them out in the sun for a bit to dry off before you return them, because we don't want things getting moldy. You can remove wax with an old credit card or paste made of baking soda and coconut oil. Make sure to store your jars of honey in a warm place if you have one, to keep things from getting crystallized. And take a beauty shot of your harvest. So yeah, take a picture, share it with the guild, share it on the mailing list. We'd love to see your harvest. Everybody likes to celebrate, some of the fruits of all of this labor. So please celebrate and share. A couple more slides, and we're almost at the end. Brix testing. So I mentioned we would talk about this. This is an example of what a Brix detector looks like. You can get them for about $20 on Amazon. I have a flow hive. So when I extract from the flow hive, from the flow frames in particular, I'd like to test to make sure that the water content is low enough, because it's hard for me to see that all of the cells were capped. So it's a good idea to test it in those conditions, in conditions where you are extracting more than just a few frames that are uncapped, and that will tell you if the water content is over 18%. So if it's over 18%, then that honey will eventually ferment. So you will want to either use it quickly, like to make mead, to bake with, whatever you plan on doing with the honey. You can refrigerate it; that'll keep it longer. But there are also methods of drying it out, but I'm not going to get into that now. So you can ask questions about that. We can get to those, or you can also use the internet. You'll need to calibrate your Brix meter occasionally according to instructions. You can use olive oil to calibrate it. You don't need anything special. This is general instructions on how to use a Brix meter. Those also come with the meter itself. Okay, so I've made it through all of this, and I hope I've impressed on you that extracting can be fun, but it is not a small amount of work. So if you have the means and you do not particularly enjoy the idea of extraction, there are guild members and otherwise that will offer extraction as a service. So if you would like somebody else to extract your frames for you, you can pay somebody to do that. Many of the guild members will also bottle for you as a service. So if you are one of those guild members who's on the call now, and you will either do extraction or bottling or both, please put your contact info in the chat so that the membership can contact you for more information on pricing and that sort of thing.
And then we have one follow-up. If
Yep.
we can go back to talking about spinning the frames.
Sure.
Mark made a comment about blowing out the frames. Do you want to address that?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so when sometimes when you spin really hard, this happens probably more with the electric rather than the manual, the inside part of the frame may bow out. Is that what you mean, Shannon?
Yes.
Yeah. So this doesn't necessarily mean that the frame is destroyed. As long as like you can kind of push the center back in, the bees will like repair that frame and reuse it. If you end up with the, you've got cell backing that like completely falls out, you may need to reinstall it. Was there anything else that you wanted me to cover on that?
Just, if you're spinning that hard, you're doing it too hard if you're blowing your frames out of shape.
The note about blowing out frames, that was about people who are using foundationless frames. They need to be a bit more gentle and careful because it's much more fragile, the comb in that case.
And,
cool.
And Mark also earlier mentioned another aspect where you can, especially for those more delicate frames, spin it out half on one side, flip it, spin it out the other way, keep going, flip back and forth. You can get, keep them from being, the frame itself from being too off balanced and causing a problem.
And Peter, for the beginners here, would you explain the difference between a foundation and a foundationless frame, please?
Sure. Those frames have, we see them usually with bee honeycomb on both sides of them, but right in the middle, there's often a piece of plastic with little honeycomb ridges on it that encourage the bees to make cells that are just the right size for worker bees. But if you don't have that piece of plastic, the bees will will fill it in with honeycomb anyway. The reason that sometimes they'll put the honeycomb going sideways to your frames, and that makes it not work for being able to pull it in and out and stuff. But the frame itself, if it has something in the middle of it, that's called a foundation. Used to be people used wax to make the foundation. These days, almost everybody uses plastic foundation, or a lot of people don't use any foundation at all. But then you have to be much more delicate when you're extracting through in an extractor.
And then we have another comment from Elise who'd like you to clarify, Alex, on what leaving the stickies out and illegal robbing is. That's an important point. If you could go through that slide again.
Sure. I won't pull the slides back up, but I can speak to it. So it is not permitted by the Ag Department to leave honey or like frames that need to be licked clean out in the open for multiple creatures to come and lick clean. So like you've got these boxes full of frames that you've extracted. They're covered in honey, the honey that we weren't able to extract off the frames. So if you were the easiest thing to do would be to leave those out in a field and just like let the bees fly to it and clean it up. And they will indeed do that, but that's not allowed. It's not legal to do that. I don't know if it's nationwide or just like statewide or countywide, but where we are in San Mateo County, it is not legal to leave the frames out in the open to be cleaned in that way. You need to place them on a hive for the hive to clean them. So that's when I was talking about making sure that you put those, that super full of frames that need to be cleaned back on top of a hive between the inner cover and the outer cover. The inner cover will kind of tell the bees, hey, this area that I'm going into through the small opening in the inner cover is not part of the hive right now. It's just a a bonus room full of honey for me to lick clean and bring back into the brood box.
A honey bar.
A honey bar. Cool. It looks like Dr. J has also left a comment in the Q&A section saying that he's decided to get out of beekeeping. Dr. J, if you would please send an email to the list rather than using this as your forum for announcing that. I don't have an easy way of sharing that information that you've posted with everyone. So I'm not sure if everybody can see that, but
I can't see it.
okay, yeah. So please, that is what the email list is for.
The Google group.
Yeah, the Google group.
We have another comment from Jess that says, what should you do with the stickies if you're harvesting from a hive that died and you don't have another hive to clean them for you?
The stickies, as long as the honey was not, was like dry, actually it doesn't really matter. Those frames will be licked clean even if they get a little bit of mold on them. You don't need to worry too much about storing stickies that weren't cleaned. It's generally going to be okay. Like the bees will figure it out. You're not going to have to discard those frames if they get a little bit of mold on them. So in that case, I would probably just freeze them and then store them. But feel free to pipe up if somebody else has a different suggestion.
I think that's a good point. Be sure you freeze them if they're not being licked clean before you store them for your next swarm.
I'll just emphasize that you always want to freeze them before storing to kill any eggs on them. But yeah, if you don't, having them licked clean by the bees is a nice to have, and it's a good thing. It makes it a lot easier to store them with less mess. They're less attractive to pests. And they don't have like honey crystallizing in there over the winter. But if your hive is dead, your hive is dead, and it won't be a big deal if you do have to store them while they're still a little wet.
That's why you have two hives and you put them on the other hive.
Yes, we do really encourage beginners to have two hives.
Yes. The other, it's also possible to not freeze them and store them out in the bright sunlight where the wax moths will be disincentivized to come lay eggs, etc. But that's what people who have really lots and lots of frames end up having to do. It supposedly works.
I do that.
Yeah.
Because I have too many, and I just put the supers on their side and make sure the wind could go through them in the sun.
And the sun can get to them. But you want to do that only after they've been cleaned. You would not want to do that with stickies. You'd be inviting robbing.
Correct. If we don't have any more questions, I'd like to give a huge thank you to Peter and Alex and Elizabeth, all for helping make this a successful Zoom, talking about bottling and extracting. Are there any other questions? Alice Larios is sharing, if you do use the hot knife, be sure you keep a wet rag nearby to wipe the knife free of honey in between usage. The honey will carbonize on the knife over a short period of time, and it stickens to get it off at that stage.
Yeah, if I can add just one more little tip here. I actually do my uncapping just with a very, very sharp serrated bread knife, or sometimes just a sharp carving knife. That also works great. What I usually do is I uncap what I can with the knife, you know, the parts that's sticking out nicely. And then if there's like a little part that's a bit concave or the bees drew it a little wobbly, then I go in and I uncap with the uncapping fork. I recommend that everybody spend kind of extra time getting that uncapping as perfect as you can. That way you get all the honey out of the frames and you don't end up with cells that didn't end up emptied and then they end up crystallizing or causing more mold problems and things like that. I feel it's like if you spend a little bit more attention on that part, it really helps everything to go nicer.
We have one more question that Elizabeth, you might know the answer for this one. We did talk about specifications on the label of what needs to be there legally. The question is, when bottling for sale, are there specific ag regulations that need to be followed? Is there anything else besides what we covered of not using organic or non-GMO? You need to list your address. You need to list both in ounces and grams.
Yeah, so when I made this, that slide, I kind of condensed down the information to that bare bones. I recommend that you just Google California state laws, honey labeling, and look at it, because there's rules about things like rounding and how many decimal places and all kinds of crazy nonsense. I mean, not that the bee police are going to come and get you as a tiny sideliner, but you know, you just want to make sure that you're doing everything correctly. I do want to add that even if you do feel that your honey is all eucalyptus, I believe it is still not legal for you to label it as a varietal unless you can prove that you are right in the middle of nothing but a gigantic eucalyptus grove. So varietal honey can only be labeled as a varietal if it meets certain circumstances, which nobody here in suburbia meets, and nobody here can meet the requirements for organic or non-GMO, because of course you can't tell your bees not to go to your neighbor's house where they're using whatever they please.
Thanks.
And then David Rickling's asking about joining the Google group. David, can you send an email to editor@sanmatobeeguild.org, and I will answer your question offline. editor@sanmatobeeguild.org. Jason is asking about the recording. I myself actually don't know. Where are we posting the recordings? Are we posting them on the website? I know they're not immediate for how, do you know, Alex, what the...
Yeah, I can, I'll send an email out with all of the recordings that we have. So it's from the start of Shelter in Place. I was waiting for our last presenter to give me the go-ahead for posting the video, but I'll go ahead and send that out as well.
Okay, and we could maybe put that in the newsletter also as a reiterative so people can find it somewhere else.
Yep, that makes sense.
Let's see if there's anything else here. Any other questions? Last questions? I see lots of thanks in the chats.
Well-deserved thanks.
There's
Thank you, everybody.
one more tip. Another tip, you can shake uncapped frames, and if anything shakes out, that it's not ready to extract. So Alice is talking about where we were saying, you know, if you have the majority of your frames capped or not, if you shake a frame and you see liquid come out, then you're going to have a lot of water content in your honey. So that's a great tip, to shake a frame.
Shake it over the hive.
Yes.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Good night.
Good night.